November 20th, 1943, just before dawn. The Central Pacific lies flat and metallic under a pale sky. Coral reefs sit inches beneath the surface, invisible from a distance, lethal up close. Beyond them, a thin strip of land, Bedio Island, Tarawa Atoll, bristles with concrete, steel in waiting guns. Japanese defenders peer through firing slits carved into palm logs and reinforced bunkers. They have been told this place cannot be taken. Then, the horizon begins to move. Not with ships alone, but with order, with timing, with layers. Naval gunfire rolls in measured waves. Carrier aircraft arrive on schedule, not chaos. Landing craft form lines, not swarms. Tracked vehicles crawl forward where boats should have died. From hardened command posts, Japanese officers watch through binoculars, confused not by American numbers, but by American method. This is not the reckless frontal assault they expected. This is something rehearsed, calculated, almost industrial. For 2 years, Japan had trusted the sea and the reef to do half the killing. At Tarawa, that faith begins to fracture, and in the weeks that follow, at Kwajalein, it will collapse entirely. Because what is unfolding here is not just an invasion, but the revelation of a new kind of war. And to understand why it shocked its defenders so deeply, the story must begin earlier. By the middle of 1943, the Pacific War no longer resembled the conflict Japan had unleashed 18 months earlier. In December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army had struck with speed, surprise, and terrifying coordination. In 6 months, they carved an empire that stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands. American, British, Dutch, and Australian forces reeled. Many in Tokyo believed the outer perimeter, once fortified, would be unbreakable. But war does not freeze in the shape of its opening moves. By 1942, the United States had stopped reacting and started learning. Guadalcanal became the turning classroom. There, the U.S. Marine Corps and Navy discovered, often through failure, that amphibious warfare was not a single event, it was a system. Landings meant nothing without logistics. Naval gunfire meant little without timing. Air cover failed without coordination. The Japanese, meanwhile, interpreted Guadalcanal differently. They saw a costly American gamble that barely succeeded. They saw high U.S. losses and assumed those losses would multiply against stronger defenses. The ocean, the reef, and fortified islands would bleed any invader white. This assumption hardened into doctrine. By 1943, Japan's defensive strategy centered on holding key atolls long enough to inflict catastrophic casualties. The goal was not victory on the beach, but psychological collapse back in Washington. Each island would become a killing ground, each reef a moat. What Japanese planners underestimated was how quickly the Americans were changing. Across the Pacific, the U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, and Army were refining amphibious warfare into a science. Specialized landing craft multiplied. The Higgins boat, with its shallow draft and ramped bow, allowed faster unloading. More critically, tracked amphibious vehicles, landing vehicle tracked, or LVTs, were being tested for reef crossings. Intelligence, once fragmented, became centralized. Aerial reconnaissance improved. Underwater demolition teams began quietly mapping obstacles. Rehearsal landings were conducted on islands that looked and felt like future targets. This was not improvisation, it was institutional adaptation. Leadership also evolved. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, rejected wasteful frontal assaults when alternatives existed. Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance emphasized precision in preparation. Marine General Holland Smith pushed relentlessly for integrated planning between sea, air, and ground. Japan noticed none of this in full. Their intelligence assessments still leaned on earlier American failures. They believed U.S. troops lacked endurance. that Americans relied too heavily on firepower, that once the landing wave stalled, morale would collapse. Instead, American doctrine shifted toward overwhelming synchronization. The strategic objective for 1943 was clear: break through Japan's outer defensive ring in the Central Pacific. The Gilbert Islands, specifically Tarawa Atoll, stood in the way. Small, isolated, heavily fortified. From the Japanese perspective, perfect. From the American perspective, necessary. Tarawa was chosen not because it was easy, but because it forced the system to work. If amphibious doctrine failed here, it would fail everywhere. If it succeeded, the path forward would open across the Marshall Islands and beyond. Japanese commanders on Batio believed they were ready. They did not realize they were about to face an enemy that had learned how to land not by courage alone, but by design. And design would matter even more when the focus shifted to the next target.
Tarawa Atoll was small, deceptively so. Batio Island, the focal point of the coming assault, measured barely 2 miles long and less than half a mile wide. From the air, it looked insignificant, an arc of sand and palm trees surrounded by turquoise water. From the ground, it was a fortress. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki commanded the Japanese garrison. He believed, with reason, that Batio could not be taken in less than 100 years. His confidence rested on geography and engineering. The surrounding coral reef extended hundreds of yards offshore. At low tide, landing craft would ground, forcing attackers to wade under fire. Every approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire from pillboxes, coastal guns, and reinforced shelters. The Japanese had studied amphibious assaults carefully. They knew the enemy had to come by sea. They built for that certainty. But Tarawa was not just a defensive experiment, it was a strategic gateway. For the United States, capturing Tarawa meant proving the Central Pacific Drive was viable. The alternative, continuing solely through New Guinea, would delay the war and strain Allied coordination. Tarawa offered airfields, staging points, and momentum. It was a test not only of courage, but of process. American planners approached it differently than earlier landings. Detailed aerial photographs were analyzed. Tidal charts were studied, though imperfectly. Naval gunfire schedules were mapped to the minute. Carrier strikes were layered to suppress known gun positions. Most importantly, the assault waves were structured with redundancy. If one element failed, another would compensate. Yet even with preparation, uncertainty remained. The tide calculations proved wrong. On November 20, 1943, many landing craft grounded on the reef earlier than expected. Marines were forced to disembark hundreds of yards from shore. Casualties mounted quickly. For the Japanese, this moment appeared to confirm every assumption they held. Then, something unexpected happened. Tracked amphibious vehicles began crawling over the reef, not in great numbers, but enough. They carried men forward under fire, delivering them closer to the beach than any defender believed possible. Losses were heavy, but the flow did not stop. By the third day, Batio fell. Nearly the entire Japanese garrison was killed. Shibasaki himself died early in the fighting, severing centralized command. The island was taken, but at a cost that shocked American audiences and commanders alike. The lesson, however, was not retreat. It was refinement. 6 weeks later, attention turned to Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Larger, more complex, more strategically vital. Unlike Tarawa, Kwajalein offered multiple islands, deep lagoons, and space to maneuver. American planners applied Tarawa's lessons mercilessly. This time, outer islands were seized first to isolate the target. Bombardment lasted days, not hours. Landing sites were chosen with flexibility, not rigidity. Japanese defenses were bypassed rather than confronted head-on. For Japanese commanders in the Marshalls, the shift was unmistakable. What they saw was not repetition, but escalation, a force that had absorbed loss and responded with overwhelming adaptation. Amphibious warfare was no longer an experiment. It was doctrine, refined under fire. At Kwajalein, Japanese officers would witness something deeply unsettling. The Americans were no longer learning, they had learned. And that realization would reshape the way the war unfolded from this point forward.
For the Marines approaching Tarawa, the battle began long before they reached land. Inside landing craft, men sat shoulder to shoulder, soaked with spray and sweat, rifles held tight against their chests. Many had rehearsed this moment on distant beaches. None of those rehearsals included coral reefs that stopped boats cold under machine gun fire. When ramps dropped too far from shore, there was no pause for debate. Men stepped into chest-deep water carrying 80 pounds of gear. Some never stood up again. Others pushed forward, moving from crater to crater, guided less by orders than by instinct. What defined Tarawa for those who survived was not confusion, but persistence. Units dissolved and reformed in minutes. Junior leaders took command when officers fell. Marines learned in real time how to fight on a beach that offered no cover and no retreat. Japanese defenders noticed this immediately. They expected hesitation. They saw none. From inside bunkers and command posts, Japanese soldiers watched the landing unfold with a mixture of certainty and surprise. Their training emphasized defensive endurance. They were not expected to survive, but to kill enough attackers to make the invasion meaningless. Every weapon was sighted with purpose. Every approach was rehearsed. Initially, the plan appeared to work. American casualties mounted. Landing craft burned. Bodies floated in the lagoon. To many defenders, this looked like vindication. The reef was doing its job. Then, the Americans kept coming. Not recklessly, but systematically. Naval gunfire adjusted. Aircraft shifted targets. Assault waves continued despite losses. Where a pillbox survived bombardment, it was isolated. Where a strong point resisted, it was bypassed. The most unsettling realization for Japanese commanders was that American momentum did not depend on any single success. The system absorbed failure and advanced anyway. This was not how the war was supposed to unfold. At Tarawa and later at Kwajalein, technology was not dramatic, it was practical. Tracked amphibious vehicles were slow, noisy, and vulnerable, but they crossed reefs. They carried radios. They moved wounded and ammunition forward under fire. They turned geography from an obstacle into a variable. Equally important was invisible technology. Timing tables, fire control coordination, aerial photography, and logistics schedules measured in minutes. Naval gunfire was no longer simply overwhelming, it was sequenced. Aircraft strikes were synchronized with landing waves. At Kwajalein, this planning reached maturity. Bombardment isolated islands before landings began. Japanese guns were neutralized before they could influence the beach. Assaults landed where defenses were weakest, not strongest. To Japanese observers, this was deeply troubling. They had prepared for bravery, they had prepared for sacrifice, they had not prepared for an enemy whose greatest weapon was organization. And as these angles converged, the battles moved closer to their decisive moments where planning, endurance, and adaptation would collide under fire. Japanese coastal defense doctrine was built on certainty. The enemy would come ashore at predictable points. He would be slowed by reefs, channelized by terrain, and destroyed by intersecting fire. It was a plan that assumed rigidity on both sides. At Tarawa, that rigidity began to fail. When initial landings stalled, American commanders did not halt the assault, they adjusted it. Naval gunfire shifted inland. Smoke was used to blind firing positions. Units landed wherever they could, not where they were originally scheduled to land. Small groups pushed forward independently, collapsing defenses from the inside out. At Kwajalein, this flexibility became deliberate policy. Rather than attacking the strongest points, American forces seized surrounding islands first. They cut supply lines. They destroyed artillery before it could influence the landing beaches. By the time troops went ashore on Kwajalein Island itself, Japanese defenders were isolated, disoriented, and already wounded by days of bombardment. For Japanese tacticians, this was devastating. The beach was no longer the battle. It was merely the opening phase. Leadership defined the difference between the two sides. Japanese command structures emphasized centralized control and fixed defensive plans. When senior officers were killed, as happened early at Tarawa, coordination collapsed. Junior leaders were expected to fight to the end, not to adapt. American leadership, by contrast, encouraged initiative within a framework. Orders established intent, not scripts. When communications failed, small unit leaders acted without waiting for permission. When plans broke, commanders revised them in hours, not days. At Kwajalein, this difference was stark. American commanders modified landing schedules mid-operation. Fire support was retasked in real time. Success was measured not by adherence to plan, but by progress toward objectives. Japanese commanders watching these operations recognized something dangerous. They were fighting an enemy whose strength did not rest on any single leader. Perhaps the most important angle was invisible. Japanese doctrine promised that fortified islands would impose unbearable costs. Tarawa was meant to prove that belief. Instead, it exposed its limits. Despite heavy losses, the Americans did not withdraw. Despite unexpected obstacles, the landings continued. At Kwajalein, the methodical destruction of defenses before the first wave landed sent a clear message. This was not a war of attrition on the beach. It was a war of preparation. Japanese reports after Kwajalein reflected shock, not at American bravery, but at American planning. The realization set in quietly but firmly. Static defenses alone could not stop this enemy. And with that understanding, the war entered a phase where belief gave way to inevitability. The decisive moments were now unavoidable. The invasion of Tarawa began at 8:30 on November 20, 1943. Naval guns had been firing for hours. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers poured shells on Debatio in a bombardment believed to be sufficient. From offshore, it looked overwhelming. From inside Japanese bunkers, much of it passed overhead. When the first waves moved in, the tide betrayed the plan. Landing craft grounded on the reef hundreds of yards from shore. Marines disembarked into open water under direct fire. Machine guns stitched the lagoon. Mortars fell with precision. Casualties mounted within minutes. For a moment, the battle teetered. Japanese defenders believed this was the decisive phase. They had prepared for exactly this scenario, and initially they were right. The reef slowed the assault. The beach was a killing zone. But the American system absorbed the shock. Tracked amphibious vehicles continued forward. Some burned, others made it through. They delivered men, ammunition, and radios closer to the seawall. Destroyers moved dangerously close to shore, firing point-blank into bunkers. Naval gunfire shifted from schedule to necessity. By midday, small groups of Marines clung to narrow footholds along the beach. There was no single breakthrough. Instead, there were dozens of small, brutal advances. Bunkers were isolated, flamethrowers were brought forward, engineers blew openings through obstacles. Japanese positions that could not be reduced were bypassed. Rear Admiral Shibasaki was killed early in the fighting, severing coordinated command. Without centralized control, Japanese resistance became fragmented, fierce, but disconnected. By the second night, American forces held a tenuous grip on Debatio. Supplies trickled in. Wounded were evacuated under fire. The assault did not pause. On November 23rd, organized resistance ended. Nearly the entire Japanese garrison, over 4,600 men, was killed. American casualties exceeded 3,000, with more than 1,000 dead. The cost stunned the public. Photographs brought the reality of amphibious war into American homes. But within military headquarters, a different conclusion formed. Tarawa was not a failure. It was proof. Proof that even under worst conditions, miscalculated tides, intact defenses, heavy losses, the system worked. The landing continued. The island fell. Lessons were extracted immediately. Those lessons would be applied with ruthless efficiency at the next objective, and when American forces turned their attention to the Marshall Islands, the Japanese would witness not repetition, but transformation.
Kwajalein was where the meaning of Tarawa became unmistakable. The operation began long before the first landing craft moved. In mid-January 1944, American forces initiated a systematic campaign against the Marshall Islands. Outer atolls were seized first, not for glory, but for isolation. Japanese supply routes were cut, airfields were neutralized, Kwajalein was sealed off. Unlike Tarawa, there would be no rush. Naval bombardment began days in advance. Battleships and cruisers fired with methodical precision. Carrier aircraft struck repeatedly, not to shock, but to dismantle. Each known gun position was targeted, each bunker was mapped, marked, and reduced. Japanese defenders waited underground, listening. When landings began on January 31st, the difference was immediate. Assault waves landed on carefully selected beaches. LVTs crossed reefs in force, delivering troops directly onto sand that had already been pulverized. Units advanced behind rolling fire support. Communication lines functioned. Reserves moved where needed. There was no moment of crisis. Japanese resistance, though determined, was fragmented from the start. Command structures were shattered before the first Marines stepped ashore. Artillery had been destroyed or rendered ineffective. Reinforcements could not move between islands. For Japanese officers observing the assault, disbelief replaced hope. This was not the battle they had prepared for. There was no decisive beach where the enemy could be broken. There was no single point of failure. Every defensive assumption about timing, about terrain, about attrition had been invalidated. By February 7th, Kwajalein was secured. American casualties were significantly lower than at Tarawa. Japanese losses were catastrophic. The atoll, once considered a stronghold, fell in days. More important than the numbers was the psychological impact. Tarawa had been a warning. Kwajalein was confirmation. The United States had mastered amphibious warfare at scale. Planning, logistics, firepower, and flexibility had fused into an instrument of war that could be repeated, refined, and accelerated. Japanese commanders now understood the truth. This enemy could not be stopped at the shoreline. The consequences of that realization would ripple outward across the Pacific, reshaping every defense that followed. When the guns fell silent at Tarawa and Kwajalein, the physical destruction was total, but the deeper impact lay in what both sides understood afterward. At Tarawa, the price had been unmistakable. Of roughly 4,800 Japanese defenders, only a handful survived to be taken prisoner. American forces suffered over 3,000 casualties in 76 hours, including more than 1,000 killed. The scale of loss, compressed into such a small space, shocked commanders and civilians alike. Photographs and film footage reached the United States within weeks. For the first time, Americans saw their dead on the battlefield in graphic clarity. The reaction was visceral. Questions were asked. Doubts surfaced. Inside military planning rooms, however, the response was analytical. Tarawa was dissected relentlessly. Tide miscalculations were corrected. NVT production was accelerated. Naval gunfire doctrine was rewritten to emphasize sustained, targeted bombardment rather than symbolic destruction. Communications procedures were tightened. Medical evacuation plans were improved. The objective was simple: ensure Tarawa never happened again in the same way. At Kwajalein, the results of that effort were visible. Japanese losses exceeded 7,800 killed. American casualties numbered fewer than 2,000.
The contrast was stark, and it did not go unnoticed. Reports from Japanese survivors and intercepted communications revealed growing concern, not about courage or resolve, but about inevitability. Japanese officers noted the overwhelming preparatory fire. They described landings that occurred only after defenses had been rendered ineffective. They observed how American forces avoided strong points rather than sacrificing men to take them head-on. The old equation, fortifications plus sacrifice equals victory, no longer held. For American commanders, Kwajalein validated a new operational rhythm: isolate, bombard, land, advance, repeat. Amphibious assault was no longer a gamble, it was a process. For Japan, the immediate aftermath carried a darker meaning. If outer defenses could be dismantled this efficiently, then the inner ring, the Marianas, the Philippines, Okinawa, would face an enemy that no longer needed to learn. The silence after Kwajalein was not relief, it was recognition. And recognition would shape everything that followed.
The fall of Tarawa and Kwajalein sent shockwaves far beyond their reefs and lagoons. For the United States, these victories unlocked the Central Pacific. Airfields in the Marshalls extended American reach westward. Carrier task forces now operated with secure forward bases. The tempo of operations increased, not gradually, but decisively. What followed was acceleration. Within months, American forces advanced to Eniwetok, then the Marianas. Each landing refined the method introduced at Kwajalein. Bombardment grew longer, intelligence grew sharper, landings became faster, cleaner, and more overwhelming. Amphibious warfare had become an engine. For Japan, the strategic consequences were devastating. The outer defensive perimeter, once considered essential to national survival, had collapsed. The idea of stopping the enemy at the beach no longer held credibility. Defensive planning shifted inward, toward attritional battles intended to delay, not defeat. Japanese commanders began preparing for a war of exhaustion. Resources were redirected to reinforce islands closer to the home islands. Air power was concentrated, then increasingly expended in desperate counterattacks. The strategic initiative, once seized through surprise, was now irretrievably lost. Equally important was the psychological shift. Japanese reports after Kwajalein expressed disbelief at American coordination. They described an enemy whose logistics seemed limitless, whose planning anticipated resistance before it occurred. This was not the opponent of 1942. The implication was unspoken but clear. If such methods could be applied repeatedly, and they could, then each island would fall not as a heroic stand, but as a calculation. Tarawa and Kwajalein marked the moment when the Pacific War ceased to be a contest of expansion and became a contest of endurance. And endurance favored the side that could adapt faster, replace losses quicker, and refine its methods under fire. As the war moved westward, the lessons of these battles followed, and so did the cost. The question that remained was not whether the islands could be taken, but what their taking would mean for those who fought on them and for the world that would inherit the outcome. Tarawa and Kwajalein were more than battles. They were revelations. They revealed a truth about modern war. Courage alone cannot overcome preparation, coordination, and adaptation. The U.S. forces, battered at Tarawa, refined their methods and executed them flawlessly at Kwajalein. Every misstep became a lesson. Every loss became a tool for improvement. For the Japanese commanders who watched their outer perimeter collapse, disbelief turned to grim understanding. The rules had changed. The human cost was immense. Thousands of lives were lost, on both sides, in coral reefs and fortified bunkers. Yet within that cost lay a lesson for future generations of soldiers and strategists that methodical planning, rehearsed precision, and flexible leadership could transform seemingly impossible operations into achievable objectives. Strategically, these battles reshaped the Pacific War. They opened the path to the Marianas, the Philippines, and eventually Japan itself. Psychologically, they shifted the balance.
demonstrating that no defensive position, however fortified, could withstand a determined, adaptable force armed with knowledge and preparation. And quietly, amidst the smoke and coral, they left an enduring reminder. War is as much about thinking as it is about fighting, and sometimes the greatest weapon is the one invisible to the enemy, the mind behind the plan. The seas of the Central Pacific would never look the same again.